whatever. So let's get into it. This isn't very long. I can probably read this in an hour. Okay. So cool. Do I have restraint? I do. Anyone says anything, and I want to test it because I don't know if I've ever tested it. Come on, YouTube. I'm not gonna be able to see anything. Now I gotta change this shit real quick. Reconnect. Yes. Is it reconnecting? Please. Did that work? What was that? So we can base. If I disconnect, and then it gives me all the choices. Yes, I want to do all the stupid shit. So, all that looks good. Settings off, and I'm going to test it one more time, and then I think we're going to be able to get started. Okay, can if I say stuff in here, does it go out? Hello, I'm going to be reading here in just a minute. Everything is disabled except you can boo or whatever you want to do. There you go, that's what I like. Okay, whatever. I'm streaming, I was trying to set something up. Fuck it. Okay. This is Value, Price, and Profit by Karl Marx. It's a pretty short essay. It's a recommended introduction to socialist readings, so whatever. Get on. Alright, the introduction. Yeah, I'll read the introduction. Why not? The present work is an address delivered by Karl Marx at two sessions of the General Council of the First International on June 27, 1865. The circumstances which led up to this report are briefly as follows. At the sessions of the General Council on April 4th, 1865, John Weston, an influential member of General Council and English Workers' Representative, proposed that the General Council should discuss the following questions. Number 1. Can the social and material prospects of the working class be, in general, improved by wage increases? And then the second question was, do not the efforts of the trade unions secure increases have a harmful effect on other branches of industry? Weston declared that he would uphold a negative answer, so no, as the first question, and a positive answer to the second one. So basically, I want to read that again because they write horribly on these things. The first question was, can the social and material prospects of the working class be in general improved by wage increases? So basically the question there is, well, if we increase the amount of money that people get paid, is that a good thing or a bad? Or can it improve the their social and material prospects? He would say no. This Western person would say no. The second question again was, do the efforts of trade unions actually hurt, have a harmful effect? And he says that yes. Now this is a socialist, John Weston, saying that. So Karl Marx is going to be kind of funny in his initial address. So I'll skip all the boring bits and I'll get straight to when he starts talking. This evening, a special session of the International, a good old fellow, an old Owenist, Weston Carpenter, has put forward the two following propositions, which he continually defending in the Beehive. 1. That a general rise in the rate of wages would be of no use to the workers. That, therefore, etc., the trade unions have a harmful effect. If these two propositions, in which he alone in our society believes, were accepted, we should be turned into a joke on account of the trade unions here and of the infection of strikes which now prevails on the continent. I am, of course, expected to supply refutation. I ought really, therefore, to have worked out my reply for this evening, but thought it more important to write at my own book, and so shall have to defend upon improvisation. Improvisation. Wow. So basically, Karl Marx is saying, "Wow, this, I don't really take any of this seriously. I'm going to spend more of my time on the book. You might expect me to have done some studying so that I can refute this argument. I'm just going to improv instead. I'm just going to talk off the cuff, basically." So he goes in. Of course, I know beforehand that the two main points are one, that the wages of labor determine the value of commodities, and two, that if the capitalists pay 5 instead of 4 shillings today, they will sell their commodities for 5 instead of 4 shillings tomorrow. Being enabled to do so by the increased demand. Inane though this is, only attaching itself to the most superficial external appearance, it is nevertheless not easy to explain to ignorant people all the economic questions which compete with one another here. You can't compress a course of political economy into 1 hour, but we shall have to do our best. Very funny guy. Which helps because, this is dry. Nobody really wants to talk about this or learn about this. So yeah, it's refreshing. Alright, let's jump in. At the session of May 20, Weston's views were subjected to a smashing criticism by Marx, and Wheeler, a representative of the English trade unions on the General Council, also spoke about Weston. Marx did not confine himself to improvisation, but proceeded to deliver a counter-report. Proposals were made to the sessions of the Central Council to publish the reports of Marx and Weston in connection with the Marx wrote as follows to Engels on June 24th, my birthday. I have read a paper in the Central Council. It would make 2 printers' sheets, perhaps, on the question brought up by Mr. Weston as to the effect of a general rise of wages, etc. The first part of it was an answer to Weston's nonsense. The second, a theoretical explanation insofar as the occasion was suited to this. Let me real quick here. This is getting on my nerves. There we go. Okay, that should be a little better now. The noise gate was not on, I think. Should sound a lot less clipped. Okay. So Weston. Okay. I have read a paper in the Central Council. It would make 2 printer sheets, perhaps, on the question brought up by Mr. Weston as to the effect of a general rise of wages, etc. The first part of it was an answer to Weston's nonsense. The second, a theoretical explanation, insofar as the occasion was suited to this. Now, the people want to have this printed. On the one hand, this might perhaps be useful since they are connected with John Stuart Mill, Professor Beasley, Harrison, etc. On the other hand, I keep having clipping issues. What the fuck? Really? Okay, what about that? Is that better? I think that's better. We'll go with that. Alright, I'm looking down, so this should be easier. Okay. On the one hand, I have the following doubts. It is none too flattering to have Mr. Weston as one's opponent. 2. In the second part, the thing contains, in an extremely condensed but relatively popular form, much that is new, taken in advance from my book. While at the same time, it has necessarily to slur over all sorts of things. The question is whether such anticipation is expedient. The work, however, was not published either by Marx or Engels. It was found among Marx's papers after Engels' death and published by Marx's daughter, Eleanor Evelyn. In the English language, it was published under the title of Value, Price, and Profit, while the German translation bore the title of Wages, Price, and Profit. This work as Marx himself noted, falls into two parts. In the first part, Marx, while criticizing Weston, is at the same time essentially attacking the so-called theory of wages fund, which has been presented in the main by Weston in his report, and which John Stuart Mill as its most formidable supporter. The gist of the theory of wages fund is the assertion that the capital which may be expended in any given period for the payment of wages is a rigid, definite sum which cannot be augmented, and that therefore the wages of each worker are arrived at by dividing up the wages. You know what? I can hear the sound, so I want to look at something because that is not. I was not having this issue, and I thought I saved it. What about that? Oh, that's so much better. Oh my god. How do I make that always be the case? Oh. It's weird that now I can hear like some static. I wonder if I can hear that static. Let me just a second. And now it's gone away? Well, that's weird. Okay, whatever. It sounds better. We'll just go with it. Okay. Whew. Okay. Alright. Found my papers. This work as Marx himself. Let me turn my volume up. This work as Marx himself notes in two parts. Here we go. The gist of the theory of wages fund is the assertion that the capital which may be expended in any given period for the payment of wages is a rigid and definite sum which cannot be augmented, and that therefore the wages of each worker are arrived at by dividing up this wages amount, fund amount, the what from what in the country. This might not be a great source. This is garbage. From this theory, it would follow that the struggle of the working class to raise wages is expedient and even harmful. This theory was thus a weapon in the hands of employers in their struggle against the working masses. From the denial of the expediency of the economic struggle, this theory leads directly to a denial of the expediency of the political struggle of the workers, of the struggle against capitalism, and consequently preaches to the workers political abstinence, and at best, political subservience to the tutelage and leadership of the bourgeoisie. By presenting such views at the session of the General Council, Weston showed himself to be. What are all these pops? I thought this was a really decent setup, but now I'm having that. I do have a pop filter. Let me get my pop filter. Sorry about that. So what needs to happen now? Alright, that's horrible on camera. But whatever. I'm not much to look at. Not enough. Perfect. Maybe that'll improve with the pop. We'll see. Wow, it already sounds a little better now. Huh. Okay, cool. Whatever. Um, hey, look at me. I'm out on toilet. Whew. All right. So all that. And I didn't think that was gonna do anything. No, no, no. Some of them are coming. Better. I think that. Funny, this shit's still on. Let me reload. Like that. Okay, great. What screen? What is that? Game title. Comment. Awesome. Okay. It's all saved and we're in chat. All right, back to it. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay. From this theory, it would follow that the struggle of the working class to raise wages is inexpedient and even harmful. This theory was thus a weapon in the hands of employers in their struggle against the working masses, from the denial of the expediency of the economic struggle. This theory leads directly to a denial of the expediency of the political struggle of the workers, of the struggle against capitalism, and subsequently preaches to the workers political abstinence, and at best political subservience to the tutelage and leadership of the bourgeoisie. By presenting such views at the sessions of the General Council, Weston showed himself to be essentially a mouthpiece of bourgeoisie views. This was why Marx deemed it necessary to subject Weston's views to an annihilating criticism in a special counter report. The subject dealt with by Marx has lost none of its actuality at the present day. The ideas underlying the theory of wage fund continue to be put forward in more or less disguised forms, not only by capitalist economists, but also by the social fascist trade union and reformist leadership in their arguments for acceptance of wage cuts. In the second part of the present work, Marx gives popular exposition of the fundamental thesis of the theories of value and surplus value, and of the conclusions derived from these theories. As as is mentioned by Marx in his letter to Engels, this part contains an exposition of several theses from his book Capital, on which he was working at the time. Although it is so condensed, this part of the work nevertheless constitutes wow, constitutes a model of lucid exposition and a consummate popularization of the economic theory of Marx. A study of this pamphlet is still the best introduction to Marx's Capital. So that's also the reason that I'm reading it. It's based off of what's his name? I think it's John Hawkshot. There's a YouTuber made a video talking about how socialist theory is important, and this was his initial recommendation once you get ready to tackle Capital. Um, but I decided, hey, I can read this one part. Let's see what goes on. I like it so far. This is more of a this is less of a thing for other people, and this is more of a way to trick myself into doing it. Because when I'm doing all this, I'm sort of creating so many distractions that I am eliminating distractions from myself. I like it. Don't expect much. Preface. The circumstances under which this paper was read are narrated at the beginning of the work. We just read them. The paper was never published in the lifetime of Marx. It was found amongst his papers after the death of Engels. Among many other characteristics of Marx, this paper shows two especially. These are his patient willingness to make the meaning of his ideas plain to the humblest student, and the extraordinary clearness of those ideas. In a partial sense, the present volume is an epitome of the first volume of Capital. More than one of us have attempted to analyze and simplify this volume, with not too much success, perhaps. In fact, a witty friend and commentator has suggested that what is now required is an explanation by Marx of our explanations of him. I am often asked, what is the best succession of books for the student to acquire the fundamental principles of socialism? The question is a difficult one to answer, but by way of suggestion, one might say first Engels' Socialism, Scientific and Utopian, then the present work, the first volume of Capital, and the student's Marx. I need to get on this Engels' Socialism, Scientific and Utopian. Okay. My small part in the preparation of this work has been reading the manuscript, making a few suggestions as to the English forms of expression, dividing the work up into chapters and naming the chapters, and revising the proofs for press. All the rest, and by far the most important part of the work, has been done by her whose name appears on the title page. The present volume has already been translated into German. Edward Aveling? I guess. Never heard that name. Preliminary. Citizens, before entering into the subjective matter, allow me to make a few preliminary remarks. There reigns now on the continent a real epidemic of strikes and a general clamor for a rise of wages. The question will turn up at our Congress. You, as the head of the International Association, ought to have settled convictions upon this paramount question. For my own part, I considered it therefore my duty to enter fully into the matter, even at the peril of putting your patience to a severe test. Another preliminary remark I have to make in regard to Citizen Weston. He has not only proposed to you, but has publicly defended, in the interest of the working class, as he thinks, opinions he knows to be most unpopular with the working class. Such an exhibition of moral courage all of us must highly honor. I hope that, despite the unvarnished style of my paper, at its conclusion he will find me agreeing with what appears to me the just idea lying at the bottom of his thesis, which, however, in the present form, I cannot but consider theoretically false and practically dangerous. I shall now at once proceed to the business before us. 1. Production and wages. Citizen Weston's argument rested, in fact, upon two premises. Firstly, the amount of natural production is a fixed thing, a constant quantity or magnitude, as the mathematicians would say. Second, that the amount of real wages, that is to say, of wages as measured by the quantity of the commodities they can buy, is a fixed amount, a constant magnitude. Now, his first assertion is evidently erroneous. Year after year, you will find that the value and mass of production increase, that the productive powers of the national labor increase, and that the amount of money necessary to circulate this increase in production continuously changes. What is true at the end of the year, and for different years compared with each other, is true for every average day of the year. The amount of magnitude of national production changes continuously. It is not a constant, but a variable magnitude. And apart from changes in population, it must be so, because of the continuous change in the accumulation of capital and the productive powers of labor. It is perfectly true that if a rise in the general rate of wages should take place today, that rise, whatever its ulterior effect might be, would by itself not immediately change the amount of production. It would, in the first instance, proceed with the existing state of things. But if before the rise of wages the national production was variable and not fixed, it will continue to be variable and not fixed after the rise of wages. But suppose the amount of national production to be constant instead of variable. Even then, what our friend Weston considers a logical conclusion would still remain a gratuitous assertion. If I have a given number, say 8, the absolute limits of this number do not prevent its parts from changing their relative limits. If profits were 6 and wages 2, wages might increase to 6 and profits decrease to 2, and still the total amount remain 8. The fixed amount of production would by no means prove the fixed amount of wages. How then does our friend Weston prove this fixity? By asserting it. But even conceding him his assertion, it would cut both ways. While he presses it only in one direction, if the amount of wages is a constant magnitude, then it can be neither increased nor diminished. If then, in enforcing a temporary rise of wages, the working men act foolishly, the capitalists, in enforcing a temporary fall of wages, would act not less foolishly. Our friend Weston does not deny that, under certain circumstances, the working men can enforce a rise of wages, but their amount being naturally fixed, there must follow a reaction. On the other hand, he knows also that the capitalist can enforce a fall of wages, and indeed continuously try to enforce it. According to the principle of the constancy of wages, a reaction ought to follow in this case not less than in the former. The working men, therefore, reacting against the attempt at or the act of lowering wages, would act rightly. They would therefore act rightly in enforcing a rise of wages, because every reaction against the lowering of wages is an action for raising wages. Let me read that one again. They would therefore act righteously in enforcing a rise of wages, because every reaction against the lowering of wages is an action for raising wages. Okay, that makes sense. According to Citizen Weston's own principle of the constancy of wages, the working men ought therefore, under certain circumstances, to combine and struggle for a rise of wages. If he denies this conclusion, he must give up the premise from which it follows. He must not say that the amount of wages is a constant quantity, but that although it cannot and must not rise, it can and must fall. Although it cannot and must not rise, it can and must fall. Whenever capital pleases to lower it. Okay, I see what he's saying. He's saying you're trying to protect keep everything as is, but it will be lowered whenever capital decides it's going to. If the capitalist pleases to feed you upon potatoes instead of upon meat, and upon oats instead of upon wheat. You must accept his will as law of political economy and submit to it. If in one country the rate of wages is higher than in the other, in the United States, for example, then in England you must explain this difference in the rate of wages by a difference between the will of the American capitalist and the will of the English capitalist, a method which would certainly very much simplify not only the study of economic phenomena, but of all other phenomena. But even then, we might ask why the will of the American capitalist differs from the will of the English capitalist. And to answer the question, you must go beyond the domain of will. A person may tell me that God wills one thing in France, but another in England. If I summon him to explain the duality of will, he might have the brass to answer me that God wills to have one will in France and another will in England. But our friend Weston is certainly the last man to make an argument for such a complete negation of all reason. The will of the capitalist is certainly to take as much as possible. What we have to do is not to talk about his will, but to inquire into his power, the limits of that power, and the character of those limits. 2. Production, wages, profits. The address Citizen Weston read to us might have been compressed into a nutshell, if his reasoning amounted to this. If the working class forces the capitalist class to pay 5 shillings instead of 4 shillings in the shape of money wages, the capitalist will return in the shape of commodities, 4 shillings worth instead of 5 shillings worth. The working class would have to pay 5 shillings for what? Before the rise of wages, they bought with 4 shillings. But why is this the case? Why does the capitalist only return 4 shillings worth for 5 shillings? Because the amount of wages is fixed. By why is it fixed at 4 shillings worth of commodities? Why not at 3 or 2 or any other sum? If the limit of the amount of wages is settled by an economical law, independent alike of the will of the capitalist and the will of the working man, the first thing Citizen Weston had to do was to state the law and prove it. He ought then move over to have proved that the amount of wages actually paid at every given moment always corresponds exactly to the necessary amount of wages and never deviates from it. If, on the other hand, the given limit of the amount of wages is found on the mere will of the capitalist, or the limit of his avarice is an arbitrary limit, there is nothing necessary in it. It may be changed by the will of the capitalist and may therefore be changed against his will. Citizen Weston illustrated his theory by telling you that a bowl contains a certain quantity of soup to be eaten by a certain number of persons. An increase in the broadness of the spoon would produce no increase in the amount of soup. He must allow me to find this illustration rather spoony. Yeah. It reminded me somewhat of the smile employed by Menius Agrippa when the Roman plebeians struck against the Roman patricians. The patrician Agrippa told them that the patrician belly fed the plebeian members of the body politic. Agrippa failed to show that you feed the members of one man by filling the belly of another. Citizen Weston, on his part, has forgotten that the bowl from which the workmen eat is filled with the whole produce of national labor, and what that what prevents them fetching more out is neither the narrowness of the bowl nor the scantness of its contents, but only the smallness of their spoons. Awesome. Um, yeah, I like this. By what contrivance is the capitalist enabled to return 4 shillings worth for 5 shillings? By raising the price of the commodity he sells. Now, does a rise and more generally a change in the prices of commodities, do the prices of commodities themselves depend on the mere will of the capitalist? Or are on the contrary, certain circumstances wanted to give effect to that will. If not the ups and downs, the incessant fluctuations of market prices become an insoluble, insoluble, insoluble riddle. As we suppose that no change whatever has taken place, either in the productive powers of labor, or in the amount of capital and labor employed, or in the value of the money wherein the values of products are estimated, but only a change in the rate of wages. How could that rise of wages affect the prices of commodities? Only by affecting the actual proportion between the demand for and the supply of these commodities. It is perfectly true that, considered as a whole, the working class spends and must spend its income upon necessaries. A general rise in the rate of wages would therefore produce a rise in the demand for, and consequently in the market prices of, necessaries. The capitalists who produce these necessaries would be compensated for the risen wages by the rising market prices of their commodities. But how would the other capitalists who do not produce? But how would the other capitalists who do not produce necessaries? And you must not fancy them a small body. If you consider that 2/3 of the national produce are consumed by 1/5 of the population, a member of the House of Commons stated it recently to be but 1/7 of the population, you will understand that an immense proportion of the national produce must be produced in the shape of luxuries, or be exchanged for luxuries, and what an immense amount of the necessaries themselves must be wasted upon flunkies, horses, cats, and so forth. A waste we know from experience to become always much limited with the rising prices of necessaries. Well, that would be the position of those capitalists who do not produce necessaries. Well, what would be the position of the capitalists who do not produce necessaries? For the fall in the rate of profit consequent upon the general rise of wages, they could not compensate themselves by a rise in the price of their commodities, because the demand for those commodities would not have increased. Their income would have decreased, and from this decreased income they would have to pay more in the same amount of higher priced necessaries. But this would not be all. As their income had diminished, they would have less to spend upon luxuries, and therefore their mutual demand for their respective commodities would diminish. Consequent upon this diminished demand, the prices of their commodities would fall. In these branches of industry, therefore, the rate of profit would fall, not only in simple proportion to the general rise in the rate of wages, but in the compound ratio of the general rise of wages, the rise in the prices of necessaries, and the fall in the prices of luxuries. What would be the consequence of this difference in the rate of profit for capitals employed in different branches of industry? Why, the consequence that generally obtains whenever, from whatever reason, the average rate of profit comes to differ in different spheres of production. Capital and labor would be transferred from the less remuner- remunerative, I have no idea, to the more remunerative branches. And this process of transfer would go on until the supply in the one department of industry would have risen proportionately to the increased demand, and would have sunk in the other departments, according to the decreased demand. This change affected the general rate of profit would again be equalized in the different branches, as the whole derangement originally arose from a mere change in the proportion of the demand for and the supply of different commodities. The cause ceasing, the effect would cease, and prices would return to their former level and equilibrium. Instead of being limited to some branches of industry, the fall in the rate of profit consequent upon the rise of wages would have become general. According to our supposition, there would have taken there would have taken place no change in the productive powers of labor, nor in the aggregate amount of production, but that but that given amount of production would have changed its form. A greater part of the produce would exist in the shape of necessaries, a lesser part in the shape of luxury. Or what comes to the same, a lesser part would be exchanged for foreign luxuries, and be consumed in its original form, or what again comes to the same, a greater part of the native produce would be exchanged for foreign necessaries instead of for luxuries. The general rise in the rate of wages would therefore, after a temporary disturbance of market prices, only result in a general fall of the rate of profit, without any permanent change in the prices of commodities. If I am told that in the previous argument I assumed the whole surplus wages to be spent upon the necessaries, I answer that I have made the supposition most advantageous to the opinion of Citizen Weston. If the surplus wages were spent upon articles formerly not entering into the consumption of the working men, the real increase of their purchasing power would need no proof, being, however, only derived from an advance of wages. Uh, so, um, in the advance of wages. There we go. In the advance of wages, that increase of their purchasing power must exactly correspond to the decrease of the purchasing power of the capitalists. The aggregate demand for commodities would therefore not increase, but the constituent parts of that demand would change. The increasing demand on the one side would be counterbalanced by the decreasing demand on the other side. Thus, the aggregate demand remaining stationary, no change whatever could take place in the market prices of commodities. You arrive, therefore, at this dilemma. Either the surplus wages are equally spent upon all articles of consumption, then the expansion of demand on the part of the working class must be compensated by the contradiction of demand on the part of the capitalist class, or the surplus wages are only spent upon some articles whose market prices will temporarily rise. The branches of industry will produce a change in the distribution of capital and labor, going on until the supply is bought up to the increased demand in the one department of industry, and brought down to the diminished demand in the other departments of industry. On the one supposition, there will occur no change in the prices of commodities. On the other supposition, after some fluctuations of market prices, the exchangeable value of commodities will subside to the former level. On both suppositions, the general rise in the rate of wages will ultimately result in nothing else but a general fall in the rate of profit. To stir up your powers of imagination, Citizen Weston requested you to think of the difficulties which a general rise of English agricultural workers from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would produce. Think, he exclaimed, of the immense rise in the demand for necessaries and the consequent fearful rise in their prices. Now, all of you know the average wages of the American agricultural laborer amount to more than double that of the English agricultural laborer. Although the prices of agricultural produce are lower in the United States than in the United Kingdom, although the general relations of capital and labor obtained in the United States the same as in England, and although the annual amount of production is much smaller in the United States than in England. Why then does our friend ring this alarm bell? Simply to shift the real question before us. A sudden rise of wages from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would be a sudden rise to the amount of 100%. Now, we are not at all discussing the question whether the general rate of wages in England could be suddenly increased by 100%. We have nothing at all to do with the magnitude of the rise. which in every practical instance must depend upon and be suited to given circumstances. We have only to inquire how a general rise in the rate of wages, even if restricted to 1%, will act. Dismissing friend Weston's fancy rise of 100%, I propose calling your attention to the real rise of wages that took place in Great Britain from 1849 to 1859. You are all aware of the 10 hours bill, or rather 10.5 hours bill, introduced since 1848. This was one of the greatest economical changes we have witnessed. It was a sudden and compulsory rise of wages, not in some local trades, but in the leading industrial branches by which England sways the markets of the world. It was a rise of wages under circumstances singularly unpropitious. Dr. Uri, Professor Senior, and all the other official economical mouthpieces of the middle class prove, and I must say upon stronger grounds than those of our friend Weston, that it would sound the death knell of English industry. They prove that it not only amounted to a simple rise of wages, but to a rise of wages initiated by and based upon a dimin, dimin, ugh, dimin, diminishing. So close. I don't know. Diminution, dimin, diminish, diminu, diminution. I'm not sure of the quantity of labor employed. They asserted that the 12th hour you wanted to take from the capitalist was exactly the only hour from which he derived his profit. They threatened a decrease of accumulation, rise of prices, loss of markets, stinting of production, consequent reaction upon wages, ultimate ruin. In fact, they declared Maximilian Robespierre's maximum laws to be a small affair compared to it. And they were right in a certain sense. Well, what was the result? A rise in the money wages of the factory operatives, despite the curtailing of the working day. A great increase in the number of factory hands employed, a continuous fall in the prices of their products, a marvelous development in the productive powers of their labor, an unheard of progressive expansion of the markets of their commodities. In Manchester, at the meeting in 1860 of the Society of the Advancement of Science, I myself heard Mr. Newman confess that he, Dr. Uri, Sr., and other official propounders of economical science had been wrong, while the instincts of the people had been right. I mention Mr. W. Newman, not Professor Francis Newman, because he occupies an eminent position in economical science as a contributor to and editor of Mr. Thomas Cook's History of Prices. That magnificent work, which traces the history of prices from 1793 to 1853, yeah. If our friend Weston's fixed idea of a fixed amount of wages, a fixed amount of production, a fixed degree of the productive power of labor, a fixed and permanent will of the capitalist, and all of other fixedness and finality were correct, Professor Senior's forebodings would have been right, and Robert Owen, who already in 1816 proclaimed a general limitation of the working class, of the working day, the first preparatory step to the emancipation of the working class, and actually in the teeth of the general prejudice, inaugurated in on his own cook in his cotton factory at New Lanark, would have been wrong. In the very same period during which the introduction of the 10 hours bill and the rise of wages consequent upon it occurred, there took place in Great Britain, for reasons which it would be out of place to enumerate here, a general rise in agricultural wages. Although it is not required for my immediate purpose, in order not to mislead you, I shall make some preliminary remarks. If a man got 2 shillings weekly wages, and if the wages rose to 4 shillings, the rate of wages would have risen to 100%. This would seem a very magnificent thing if expressed as a rise in rate of wages, although the actual amount of wages, 4 shillings weekly, would still remain a wretchedly small, a starvation pittance. You must not therefore allow yourselves to be carried away by the high-sounding percents in rate of wages. You must therefore ask, what was the original amount? Moreover, you will understand that if there were 10 men receiving each twos per week, 5 men receiving each fives, and 5 men receiving 11s weekly, the 20 men together would receive hundreds, I should say, or £5 weekly. If then a rise by a 20% upon the aggregate sum of their weekly wages took place, there would be an advance from £5 to £6. Taking the average, we might say that the general rate of wages had risen by 25%, although in fact the wages of the 10 men had remained stationary. The wages of one lot of 5 men had risen from fives to sixes only, uh, and the wages of the other five from 55s to 70. One half of the men would not have improved at all their position. One quarter would have improved it in an imperceptible degree, and only one quarter would have been bettered really. Still, reckoning by the average, the total amount of the wages of those 20 men would have increased by 25%, and as far as the aggregate capital that employs them, the prices of the commodities they produce and concern, it would be exactly the same as if all of them had equally shared in the average rise of wages. In the case of agricultural labor, the standard wages being very different in different countries of England and Scotland, the rise effective in vary in equally. Lastly, during the period when the rise of wages took place, counteracting influences were at work, such as the new taxes consequent upon the Russian War, the extensive demolition of the dwelling houses of the agricultural laborers, and so forth. Having having premised so much, I proceed to state that from 1849 to 1859 there took place a rise of about 40% in the average rate of the agricultural wages of Great Britain. I could give you ample details in proof of my assertion, but for the present purpose think it sufficient to refer you to the uh, conscientious and critical paper read in 1860 by the late John C. Morton at the London Society of Arts on the forces used in agriculture. Mr. Morton gives the returns from bills and other authentic documents which he had collected from about 100 farmers residing in 12 uh, residing in 12 Scotch and 35 English counties. Wow. Ooh. According to our friend Weston's opinion, and taken together with the simultaneous rise in the history of the wages of the factory operatives, there ought to have occurred a tremendous rise in the prices of agricultural produce during the period 1849 to 1859. But what is the fact? Despite the Russian War and the consecutive unfavorable harvest from 1854 to 1856, the average price of wheat, which is the leading agricultural product of England, fell from about £3 per quarter from the years 38 to 48 to about £2, 10 shillings per quarter for the years 1849 to 1850. This, this constitutes a fall in the price of wheat of more than 16% simultaneously with an average rise of agricultural wages of 40%. During the same period, if we compare its end with the beginning, 1859 with 1849, there was a decrease of official pauperism from that much, the difference being 73,000, a very small decrease, I grant, and which in the following years was again lost, but still a decrease. It might be said that, consequent upon the abolition of the corn laws, the import of foreign corn was more than doubled during the period from 1849 to 1859, as compared with the period of 1838 to 1848. And what of that? From Citizen Weston's standpoint, one would have expected that this sudden, immense, and continuously increasing demand upon foreign markets must have sent the prices of agriculture produce there to a frightful height. The effect of increased demand remaining the same, whether it comes from without or from within, was the fact that, apart from some years of failing harvest, during all that period the ruinous fall in the price of corn compelled to burn their surplus produce. And Russia, if we are to believe Mr. Ur- Urquhart, prompted the Civil War in the United States because her agricultural exports were crippled by the Yankee competition in the markets of Europe. Reduced to its abstract form, Citizen Weston's argument would come to this. Every rise in demand occurs on the basis of a given amount of production. It can, therefore, never increase the supply of the articles demanded, but can only enhance their money prices. Now, the most common observation shows that an increased demand will, in some instances, leave the market prices of commodities altogether unchanged, and will, in other instances, leave the market prices of commodities altogether unchanged, and will, in other instances, cause a temporary rise of market prices, followed by an increased supply, followed by a reduction of the prices to their original level, and in many cases below their original level. Whether the rise of demand springs from surplus wages or from some other cause does not at all change the conditions of the problem. From Citizen Weston's standpoint, the general phenomenon was was as difficult to explain as the phenomenon occurring under the exceptional circumstances of a rise of wages. His argument had therefore no particular bearing whether upon the subject we treat. It only expressed his perplexity at accounting for the laws by which an increase of demand produces an increase of supply, instead of an ultimate rise of market prices. Should I do this? Yeah, this is actually pretty short. Looks like it's going to get short and then it goes long. You know what? I'm going to get some water. I'm going to go to the bathroom. And then I'm going to come back. And I'm going to see if I can go to 8. All right. All right. So this is number 5, wages and prices. Reduced to their simplest theoretical expression, all of our friends' arguments resolve themselves into this one dogma: the prices of commodity are of commodities. Oh, I should probably look stand up. Hello. All right. 5. Wages and prices. Reduced to their simplest theoretical expression, all of our friends' arguments resolve themselves into this one dogma: the prices of commodities are determined or regulated by wages. I might appeal to practical observation to bear witness against this antiquated and exploded fallacy. I might tell you that the English factory operatives, miners, shipbuilders, and so forth, whose labor is relatively high priced, undersell by the cheapness of the produce all other nations, while the English agricultural worker, for example, whose labor is relatively low priced, is undersold by almost every other nation because of the dreariness, the dearness actually, of his produce. By comparing article with article in the same country and the commodities of different countries, I might show, apart from some exceptions, more apparent and real, that on an average the high price labor produces the low price, and low price labor produces high price commodities. This, of course, would not prove that the high price of labor in the one is the low price in the other, in the respective causes of those diametrically opposed effects. But at all events, it would prove that the price of commodities are not ruled by the prices of labor. However, it is quite superfluous for us to employ this empirical method. It might perhaps be denied that Citizen Weston has put forth the dogma: the prices of commodity are determined or regulated by wages. In point of fact, he has never formulated. Uh, he said, on the contrary, that profit and rent are also formed. Uh, that okay, that profit and rent also form constituent parts of the prices of commodities, because it is out of the prices of commodities that not only the working man's wages, but also the capitalist profits and the landlord's rents must be paid. But how is his idea? But how in his idea are prices formed? First by wages, then an additional percentage is joined to the price on behalf of the capitalist, and another percentage on behalf of the landlord. Suppose the wages of the labor employed in the production of a commodity to be 10. If the rate of profit was 100% to the wages advance, the capitalist would add 10. And if the rate of rent was also 100% upon the wages, there would be added 10 more, and the aggregate price of the commodity would amount to 30. But such a determination of prices would be simply their determination by wages. If wages in the above case rose to 20, the price of the commodity who propounded the dogma that wages regulate prices have tried to prove it by treating profit and rent as mere additional percentages upon wages. None of them were, of course, able to reduce the limits of those percentages to any economic law. They seem, on the contrary, to think profit settled by tradition, custom, the will of the capitalist, or by some other equally arbitrary and inexplicable method. If they assert that they are settled by the competition between the capitalists, they say nothing. The competition is sure to equalize the different rates of profit in different trades, or reduce them to one average level. But it can never determine the level itself or the general rate of profit. What do we mean by saying that the prices of the commodities are determined by wages? Wages being but a name for the price of labor. We mean that the prices of commodities are regulated by the price of labor, as price is exchangeable value. And in speaking of language, I speak always of exchangeable value. Is exchangeable value expressed in money? The proposition comes to this, that the value of commodities is determined by the value of labor, or that the value of labor is the general measure of value. But how, then, is the value of labor itself determined? Here we come to a standstill. Of course, we come to a standstill if we try reasoning logically, yet the propounders of the doctrine make short work of logical scruples. Take our friend Wesson, for example. First, he told us that wages regulate the prices of commodities, and that, consequently, when wages rise, prices must rise. Then he turned around to show us that a rise of wages will be no good because the prices of commodities had risen, had risen, and because prices were indeed measured by the prices of the commodities upon which they are spent. Thus we begin by saying that the value of labor determines the value of commodities, and we wind up saying that the value of commodities determines the value of labor. Thus we move to and fro in the most vicious cycle and arrive at no conclusion at all. On the whole, it is evident that by making the value of one commodity, say labor, corn, or any other commodity, the general measure and the regulator of value, we also shift the data, since we determine one value by another, which on its side wants to be determined. The dogma that wages determine the prices of commodities, expressed in the most abstract terms, comes to this, that value is determined by value. And this tautology means that, in fact, we know nothing at all about value. Accepting this premise, all reasoning about the general laws of political economy turns into mere twaddle. It was, therefore, the great merit of Ricardo that in his work on the principles of political economy, published in 1917, he fundamentally destroyed the old, popular, and worn-out fallacy that wages determine prices, a fallacy which Adam Smith and his French predecessors had spurned in the really scientific parts of their researches, but when they reproduced in their more exoterical and vulgarizing chapters. All right, so there's plenty more, but I am exhausted.